Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Much less lofty now, I suspect, Mr. Speaker.
It doesn't have to be. Doesn't have to be.
Well, we'll see the answer. My question is to the Prime Minister, and it goes to national security. Does the Prime Minister doubt which side people are on when they support the unanimous position of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for his question and raising the role of the Joint Standing Committee. The Joint Standing Committee on these matters does important work in this parliament, and when members come to that committee, they bring forward the positions of their various parties to address the national security issues the countries face. And what I have noted in my time in this place is that it has always been those who sit on this side of the House who have always brought the stronger position. It is always those sit on this side of the House,
members on both sides,
with the measures that we've brought before that committee, that the matters have been sought to be watered down. And therefore it is always going to be the action of my government to ensure that where those matters are watered down, we will always seek to remedy it and always keep Australia strong.
I call the member for Hunter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is also to the Prime Minister. Why is it the proposed drought fund will not deliver a cent until at least next July?
The Prime Minister has the call. Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for his question on the Drought Future Fund, a fund that the Labor Party is opposing. They opposed it in the last parliament. We put it in the budget. We took it to the Australian people. The Australian people returned the government to ensure that we could get on with the job of supporting our farmers through one of the toughest droughts that this country has ever seen. This government has delivered some $7 billion worth of support to our farmers and our rural communities all around the country. Most recently, that has included more than $110 million, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Hunter on a point of order.
Obviously, on relevance, Mr. Speaker, the question was very tight. I asked the Prime Minister, why is it the proposed drought fund will not deliver 1 cent to farmers until at least July next year?
The member for Hunter will resume his seat. Yes, the question was very specific. The Prime Minister is entitled to a preamble on the subject, which I'm sure he's almost finished. He is only about 40 seconds into the question. I'll also point out to those on my left, even when a question is very specific, the practice makes clear you can't sort of demand a one-word or a two-word answer either. But the Prime Minister is entitled to a preamble. He's been doing that. I don't need the help of the member for Lyons. He's entitled to do that. He's been strictly on the policy topic, but I'm sure that he'll be bringing his preamble to a conclusion.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The point I'm making is the government has been acting each and every day on the issue of supporting rural communities in relation to the drought. Whether it has been the immediate assistance that has been required to support communities through the $1 million payments to each of the shires and councils around the country, or it has been to invest in the water infrastructure projects which build resilience. Now, we are investing in those projects right now, and the future drought fund will enable us to continue to invest in those drought-resilient projects into the future. So we are funding those drought resilience projects right now out of the budget, and from the 1st of July next year we'll be drawing down $100 million out of a fund that will increase in value to $5 billion and provide permanent funding support for drought resilience projects in this country. So I have a simple statement to make to those opposite. Why won't you support farmers going through the drought, Mr. Speaker? How on earth could the Leader of the Opposition And I will call him the Leader of the Opposition because I'm yet to find something that he doesn't oppose, Mr Speaker. He opposed us on tax relief for Australians, he opposed us on security measures, and now they oppose us on the drought fund, Mr Speaker.
Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for Paterson. The member for Lindsay.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on how the government is getting on with the job of delivering its plan for a stronger and more secure Australia?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Lindsay for her question, and I commend her on her maiden speech to the parliament today, and for all of her family and other supporters who are joining us with us in the parliament. The government is getting on with the job as we're elected to do, Mr Speaker, and that is to secure Australia's future, to keep our economy strong, to guarantee the essential services that Australians rely on, to keep Australians safe and to continue to bring Australians together to face the challenges that are ahead of us. And when we were last here, we passed into law, with not great any assistance from those opposite, Mr Speaker, tax relief for millions of Australians, including 77,000 Australians living in the electorate of Lindsay, who now have access to that legislated tax relief which the opposition leader was seeking to oppose right to the last moment, Mr Speaker. 3.5 million Australians benefiting from that tax relief straight away. On top of that, there is some 14,383 small businesses and family businesses in the electorate of Lindsay, which is also benefiting from the tax relief we are providing to those businesses. And these policies, which enable people to keep more of what they own, something that is opposed by the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker, this is contributing to some of the strongest employment growth we've seen at 2.6%. Now, Mr Speaker, there's 296,000 jobs that have been created in the last 12 months. 80% of those are full-time. That is the strongest full-time jobs growth we've seen in 12 years. There is $100 billion being spent on infrastructure into the future, and I note that it's $25 billion more on infrastructure than was announced prior to last year's budget, when we first announced the Future Drought Fund. So there's $25 billion more going into infrastructure, which is more than 6 times the amount that Labor is trying to prevent us from putting into future drought resilience projects that we're already spending on infrastructure. So our infrastructure projects, but the congestion-busting components of that is going to relieve the congestion in our major metropolitan areas, in particular in the electorate of Lindsay, with $63 million for the Dunhaven Road project, Mr Speaker, which is all about ensuring Australians can get home sooner, they can get to work safer, and they can spend more time with their families as a result of those infrastructure projects. We're building our relationships with the region, with our most close neighbours here in particular, and we welcome the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea here today, Prime Minister Marape, but not only here directly in our region. Our work through the G20 and more broadly through the Indo-Pacific is setting up trading and economic and security opportunities all around the world. And we're keeping Australians safe, Mr Speaker. The temporary exclusion orders for those returning foreign fighters coming to Australia, they need to ensure that we can keep a close eye on those. That legislation should pass this Parliament.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for Ballarat.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. What is the point of the Independent Infrastructure Australia making recommendations to government on transport, water, energy and communications priorities if there is no money in the Building Australia Fund to fund its recommendations?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, I thank the Shadow Minister for her question and note the presence in the chamber of the American ambassador. One small step for man. Yesterday it was one giant leap forward for Parks, which is going to play such an integral part in the Inland Rail, Mr Speaker. And the Inland Rail, a $9.3 billion investment by this government because we get on and we do things. The fact is the Inland Rail was first suggested in 1890, the first plans drawn up in the early 1900s, and the Liberals and Nationals are actually building it. But more to the point of the Shadow Minister's question, Mr Speaker. 19 out of 21 projects on the infrastructure priority list are funded by the Australian government. 19 out of 21. That's not a bad result. Mr Speaker, this government has significantly transformed the way we invest in infrastructure. We have a $100 billion commitment, $100 billion investment in infrastructure right across the country. Better roads, better rail, better airports, better seaports. We are getting on with the job of building the infrastructure to, as the Prime Minister said, get Australians home sooner and safer.
The Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Ballarat on a point of order.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Of course, on relevance, it would be good if the Deputy Prime Minister actually was able to mention the Building Australia Fund.
The member for Ballarat can resume her seat. The Deputy Prime Minister's in order, and it is not in order for someone asking a question to demand that part of the question actually be mentioned. That really is kind of without precedent. The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Side of the House, Mr Speaker. I think they thought they were going to be on this side of the House, but this side of the House is actually getting on with the job in our third term, just like we did in our second term, just like we did in our first term, of building our future. Building our future. That's what we are doing. Mr Speaker, the increase in investment has been driven through annual appropriations. We are getting on with the job. You heard the Prime Minister in an earlier answer today talk about the additional $25 billion in our last budget. And this is what you can do, and this is what we will continue to do when you've got a budget going into surplus. We see the New South Wales coalition government, the Liberals and Nationals in that state, getting on with a $94 billion rollout of infrastructure across 4 years. That's what you can do when you're in surplus. Well, not 10 I hear the opposition leader talk about. 10 years, it's been actually 30 since that side actually had a surplus. We are getting on with the job. We're getting on with the job of putting our economic management into surplus, putting our budget into surplus. It's something they could only have a pipe dream. And when we talk of pipe dreams, pipelines, we have a pipeline of investment, $100 billion over the next 10 years. And we're getting on with the job. It's creating jobs. What side do those on that side sit? Do they agree with us? Do they want to get on with getting their people, their constituents home sooner and safer, or do they want to continually object and oppose everything?
The member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer explain to the House how families and small businesses in my electorate of Robertson will benefit from the Morrison government's tax cuts? Is the Treasurer aware of any alternative policies?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Robertson for a question. And I'm pleased to inform the House that 59,953 taxpayers in Robertson will get a tax cut as a result of the legislation that this parliament passed just 2 weeks ago, Mr Speaker. And in the electorate of Robertson, over 16,000 small businesses will be able to access the instant asset write-off, which has been extended to $30,000 and to companies with a turnover of up to $50 million. So those constituents in Robertson, from Gosford and Terrigal to Woy Woy, will all benefit as a result of the tax package passed in this parliament. And I can also inform the House that as of this morning, 2.9 million Australian taxpayers have put in a tax return for the 18-19 year, Mr Speaker. That's more than 460,000 more than at the same time last year. And at the Australian Tax Office has seen refunds be already delivered to Australians of more than $3 billion, Mr Speaker. This is money finding its way into the economy to be spent at a cafe, to be spent with a plumber or an electrician, to be spent in retail or in other areas as Australians see fit. And it's part of the tax package that we passed through this parliament, which will ensure that 94% of Australian taxpayers pay a marginal rate of no more than 30 cents in the dollar. Now, Mr Speaker, I'm asked, are there any alternative approaches? Well, we know that those opposite have taken every position under the sun when it comes to tax cuts in this place, Mr Speaker. Firstly, they were against it. Then they wanted to amend it. Then the Leader of the Opposition wanted to amend the title of the legislation, Mr Speaker. That great move on the Leader of the Opposition. Then you had Senator Gallagher say we can't have a position on it until we know what the crossbenchers think, Mr Speaker. And then the Labor Party said they supported the tax cuts. And then the best. When the dust had settled, the best position was the Labor Party blamed us for stopping our own tax cuts, Mr Speaker. They had every position under the sun. So you can imagine our amusement on the weekend when we picked up The Age to read an article by Rob Harris, who quoted an anonymous shadow minister saying we need to show we've learned our lesson on the tax debacle and from the election, and when it comes to the drought fund, he said we can't be blocking this again. Now, Mr Speaker, which one of those opposite was the anonymous? Which was the anonymous quote? I'm not looking at anyone, Mr Speaker. I'm not looking at anyone. The shy, retiring member for Hunter. Well, Mr Speaker, we won't know who it was who said that to Rob Harris, but we do know that this side of the House are full.
The deputy PM is going to stop talking. That's what's going to happen. The member for Hunter has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Drought, and I ask him, why is it the government no longer has a drought envoy?
Yeah, good.
The Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And well, it's finally we've seen the member for Hunter crawl out from under that rock that he's been hiding for 6 years. Wasn't game enough to ask me a question. Not one question did I get in the last Parliament about drought or anything else, because we've made a commitment to those that have been impacted by drought. To politicise the misery of Australian farmers is nothing short of the lowest political act that I saw in the last Parliament. We put in place a systematic way to address it, to listen to communities at the grassroots, not only with the Drought Envoy, but with Major General Day, who finished up on the 30th of June, about making sure that we sat around kitchen tables, we sat in sheds listening to farmers and to communities, because it's not just farmers that hurt. It's also the communities that support them. And that's why we're putting in place $1.9 billion in support in the here and now, but a future fund that you voted against, those opposite voted against before the last election, to politicise the misery of Australian farmers by trying to score a cheap political point. People in this country want leadership. They don't want politics. You are playing with the lives of Australian farming families. This is above politics. This is better. This is something that we can do better as a parliament, to get behind this today, to support us, to have a strategic policy backed by a centrepiece $5 billion future fund, a future fund that goes on to support Australian farming families, not just in the here and now that can be taken away at the whim of a treasurer, but legislated, protected, to make sure that we make that commitment for longevity, to ensure those regional communities support. It's as simple as that. The question now comes to those opposite. Who do you support?
The Minister will just pause for a second. Whoever's interjecting, they're not helping anyone, let alone themselves. Sorry? Yeah. Again, this was a specific question, and whilst the Minister's been on the topic of it, with almost 2 minutes gone, it was a very, very specific question. And I'm just going to ask the Minister either to address it or wind up his answer.
Happy to. Both the Drought Envoy and, as I articulated earlier, Major General Day have gone to the point of consultation. It's now time to get on with the job, and that's why the Prime Minister appointed me. Elevated drought to Cabinet. For the first time in our nation's history, we had a Prime Minister who, in the first couple of days of his Prime Ministership, came to a drought-affected community and has elevated drought to the highest table of this office. That's leadership. That's not politics.
The member for Clark.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Health. Minister, I discussed with you recently the finding by respected health analyst Martin Goddard that since 2014 the Tasmanian government has failed to spend on health some $1.6 billion of GST funding earmarked for health. This is obviously no small matter in light of the systemic public health crisis being experienced in Tasmania, nor is it disputed, as a recent AAP fact-check confirmed that the Tasmanian government has indeed misspent $1.6 billion of federal health funding. Minister, will you hold the Tasmanian government to account for this deadly dereliction of its core responsibility to provide effective health services? And what safeguards will you put in place to prevent this misconduct in the future?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Clark. And we did meet in the last sitting, and we have looked very carefully at these matters. And whilst I respect the passion and the focus of the member for Clark, I respectfully disagree on the premise of his question. In fact, on investigation, what I've confirmed is that the Tasmanian government spend on health as a proportion of its budget has increased from 25% to 32%. This makes it one of the highest levels of health expenditure as a proportion of a state budget across the Commonwealth of Australia. But it comes as part of a broader partnership between the Commonwealth and the state of Tasmania, which the Prime Minister, the Treasurer, myself and the Minister for Finance have been able to develop. Tasmania receives health funding from the Commonwealth and works with the Commonwealth in a number of ways. Obviously, there is the GST which you referenced. Secondly, of course, there is the specific hospital reform agreement. And what we're seeing is that Commonwealth funding is increasing from $294 million per annum under the previous government to $424 million this financial year to $524 million by the end of the next financial agreement. In addition to that, what we see is that there are specific partnerships.
The Minister for Health will just resume his seat. The member for Clark on a point of order.
Yeah, on a point of relevance, thank you, Speaker. My question doesn't go to how much is being spent, but specifically in global terms, but specifically to whether or not the GST allocation earmarked for health is being spent in full.
I'll continue to listen to the Minister's answer. The Minister has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And the answer to that question, respectfully, is that the overall Tasmanian funding, which is informed by these variety of sources which go into it, has increased quite dramatically from 25% to 32%. And that means that Tasmania's funding is not only up in actual dollars, but is up in proportionate dollars, one of the largest increases in the country and one of the largest proportions in the country. And that brings me to the third area, and that is that there are specific partnerships, the $700 million plus Mersey Hospital agreement, which has been injected into Tasmania's funding, the funding which the Prime Minister announced as part of the campaign with the now members for Bass and Braddon, who fought so strongly for this in relation to $10 million for a mental health facility, $10 million for an eating health facility, and in particular $34.7 million for increases in emergency service elective surgery funding and TAS outreach funding. $20 million, as the member and myself discussed recently, of which the first $5 million has already been paid towards elective surgery as part of an agreement, something I've discussed with the Minister for Health, Sarah Courtenay, in Tasmania, as well as with yourself, as well as the plan to make the University of Tasmania a medical research hub through the Menzies Institute in Tasmania, as well as from the 1st of January 2020 the new rural provider number. So all of these things come together in what has been one of the most significant increases in actual dollars and proportionate dollars across the Commonwealth.
The member for Herbert.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on how the government is continuing to invest in water infrastructure across Australia and in particular in my electorate of Herbert?
Excellent. The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Herbert for his question. What a fantastic inaugural speech he made last sitting week. He is going to make such a great contribution, not just for his own electorate but indeed the nation. And it's an important question he asked today. It's about water investment. Investing in more water infrastructure right across the country is a top priority for this government. It's been far too long since we built a dam in this nation, and we will build dams to build water security, to drive economic prosperity and to create jobs right across the nation. I hear a raucous cry from those opposite. They are not interested in dams, Mr Speaker, and I would hope that the enthusiasm that they are showing now carries across to their state Labor counterparts, and I hope they show the same enthusiasm, Member for Watson, as you are in this place. During the election campaign, we made a commitment to provide more secure water for Townsville. And the difference between that side and this side is that when we say we're going to do something, you know what? We do it. We do it. We get on and we do it. The government will fully deliver, on its commitment to provide up to $195 million for the construction of Stage 2 of Townsville's Horton Pipeline project. That's what we'll do. That's what the member for Herbert fought for, and that's what he will deliver. He will deliver because he is a doer. He is a builder, and that's why he's on this side of the House. And it means more jobs. Jobs, jobs and more jobs. Indeed, 700 during construction and up to 30 ongoing roles once completed. The Townsville-Horton pipeline means the agricultural channel would not be needed for urban supply, and this channel capacity can be made available to irrigators to grow more food, to grow more fibre, to grow the local economy, to grow local jobs. Now, it'll boost the value of ongoing agricultural output by up to $3 million a year. That's a significant investment into Townsville, into the overall electorate that the member for Herbert represents, and we're also delivering the $180 million Hewenden irrigation scheme. It's a project that has the potential to establish the town, located between Mount Isa and Townsville, as a new frontier in growing crops such as grapes, as well as producing high-value cattle. Reliable water is something our regions need. They want, and they most importantly deserve. And only last week I attended the Daily Telegraph's Bush Summit in Dubbo, in the member for Parkes' electorate, with the Prime Minister indeed. Farmers there made it very clear to us. They want dams. They want pipelines. They want water infrastructure. They want to heighten, lengthen and strengthen weirs. And that's why we're getting on with doing just that. We put $500 million into the National Water Infrastructure Development Fund last year. Those opposite, well, they're not interested in regional Australia. They're not interested in water infrastructure, and it shows every day of the week.
The member for Rankin.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does he agree with 7 of his backbenchers who want to ditch the legislated increase of the superannuation guarantee to 12%?
The Prime Minister has the call.
There's no change to the government's policy.
The member for Nichols.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Water Resources, Drought, Rural Finance, Natural Disaster and Emergency Management. And can the Minister please outline to the House how this coalition government is supporting our farmers and rural and regional communities through the drought, and outline to the House what proactive measures we are taking to ensure that the long-term productivity and profitability of our farmers into the future?
The Minister for Water Resources.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And can I thank the honourable member for his question, who has seen first-hand the impact that this drought has had on his own electorate of Nichols as it spreads right across this country. And that's why this government has stood shoulder to shoulder with our farmers. To date, nearly $1.9 billion in support in the here and now, through programs such as the Farm Household Assistance, increasing the amount to be able to keep bread and butter on farmers' families' kitchen tables. It's about putting more rural financial counsellors out there to be able to sit around the kitchen tables and help our farmers fill out the paperwork, but also get clarity in the decisions that they have to make. But it's also around the nearly $30 million we put into mental health, not just for farmers, but also their families, because as children that often see the impacts of this drought, the financial strain, they see the bills in the fridge. And it's important that they're protected and understood and listened to during this. But proudly today, this government will introduce the Drought Future Fund bill, a bill that will create a fund from $3.9 billion, escalating to $5 billion, giving a dividend of $100 million a year, in the good and the bad, to be able to go and build resilience in our rural communities and farming families. It will help to address climate risk. It will help to address extension, to give our farmers the tools to understand and take up the best practices they need. It'll be about leadership and building resilience in those communities. But what we've done is made sure that we've taken the politics out of it. And I've got to acknowledge the former member for Indi and the amendments that she made around bringing integrity to it. We'll make sure that there's an independent committee that will consult with the community through a legislated consultation period of 42 days to be able to go to the people whom we're there to serve. What a crazy idea a government might go and ask them how this money should be spent, to come back and to give us the ideas and the concepts that need to be delivered. And to add another integrity measure, we're making it a disallowable instrument, so the Australian Parliament has oversight over it. This is above politics, and we are taking it above politics. We are taking this money from the Building Australia Fund, a fund that has not paid a dividend since 2015-16. Yet we have been able to deliver a $100 billion program of infrastructure spend, whether it be inland rails, right across this country. This is about making sure that we get the balance right. We are utilising a fund that has not done anything, and we are doing that in a fiscally responsible way. This is about responsibility and leadership, not politics. So the question comes, Mr Speaker, to those opposite who politicise the misery of Australian farmers in one of the lowest acts in this nation's parliament by voting against the Future Drought Fund bill back in October.
Member for McMahon.
Who do they support? Do they support Australian farming families, or do they support the continuation of cheap politics?
The member for Rankin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question again is to the Prime Minister. This morning his Trade Minister said about the legislated increase to the superannuation guarantee, and I quote, "It's not the government's intentions or plans to change what's legislated at this point in time." Will the Prime Minister rule out any changes to the legislated increase in the superannuation guarantee?
The Prime Minister has the call.
I simply say to the member what I just said. There is no change to the government's policy. But on the topic of superannuation, given we're talking about the positions of parties on superannuation, does the Labor Party stand by its more than $30 billion in higher superannuation taxes, Mr Speaker? Are they going to walk away from that, or are they going to continue to see superannuation
The member for McEwen.
and superannuants as a target for their high taxing policies? Because, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party have learnt nothing since the last election. They opposed tax relief. The Leader of the Opposition, capital O, opposed tax relief in this parliament, speaking against it inside this chamber and out. They are opposing us seeking to support the farmers and graziers and rural communities of this country by legislating the Drought Fund. Yet we continue to invest in infrastructure at record levels, up $25 billion, more than 6 times the amount that the Building Australia Fund actually had in it. We've spent more than 6 times that much in committed funding. The Leader of the Opposition is opposition with a capital O.
The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Population, Cities and Urban Infrastructure. Will the Minister inform the House of developments to connect Flinders University to the rail line, helping thousands of people every day and assisting the South Australian economy?
The Minister for Population, Cities and Urban Infrastructure.
Well, can I thank the member for Boothby for her question? And as she knows, last Friday the first sod of the Flinders Link rail project was turned. Now, this is a fantastic congestion-busting project that will extend the Adelaide Metropolitan Rail Network to Flinders Medical Centre, Flinders University and the Tonsley Innovation Precinct. And I know that the member for Boothby has been a very strong supporter for a long time of this $125 million project. So what will it mean for residents in Adelaide and in her electorate in particular? Well, first, it's going to make it easier to access Adelaide's largest hospital that they have, and it's going to ease the parking pressures which presently exist. And of course, it will also ease congestion in Adelaide as a whole by taking thousands of cars off the road. But perhaps the most important thing is that by linking the campus to the rail network, it will make it more convenient for the 25,000 existing students and also make it more attractive, Flinders University more attractive for international students to go there. And of course, the university believes that this project itself will unlock $1.5 billion worth of their investments into the university, creating thousands of jobs in the process. Because as a result of this project, they will build new student accommodation, health research facilities and retail facilities. And, Mr Speaker, this is just another great joint project by the Morrison and Marshall governments. And overall, we are investing $8.4 billion into South Australia for roads and rail transport there, and helping Premier Marshall's drive to make it a turnaround state in a similar way that Premier Hodgman in Tasmania is creating Tasmania to be a turnaround state as well, because we know that for too long in South Australia they had a long reign of the former Labor governments, which led to low growth, which led to a mass exodus of people leaving the country, and of course, as the Energy Minister knows, led to the highest electricity prices in the world. And we are changing this, and our infrastructure agenda is a very big part of supporting the regeneration of South Australia as a whole. Mr Speaker, this incredible project which we've been discussing, the Flinders Link Rail project, is just one of over 150 major projects that we have going on in this country right now. 150. That's $9.8 billion of work being invested this financial year, which is more than double what it was when we first came to office. And of course, we have another 150 in the planning of major projects, as well as over 166 smaller-scale urban congestion busing projects.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister stand by the outcome of the inquiry undertaken by his departmental secretary into the compliance of former ministers Pyne and Bishop with his ministerial standards?
The PM has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. I have accepted the advice of the Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister in Cabinet, and that response that was provided by the Secretary has been tabled in the Senate.
The member for Grey.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology. Yesterday marked the 50th anniversary of man's landing on the moon, something I'm a little reluctant to say I remember well. Can the Minister outline how the government's investment in the Australian Space Agency will benefit Australians and create new jobs?
The Minister for Industry, Science and Technology.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. I do acknowledge that Woomera, which is in his electorate of Grey, is from where Australia launched its first satellite just over 50 years ago, 52 years ago in fact. So I do thank him for his question and acknowledge the long relationship that Australia has had with the space sector. Now, clearly the moon landing was such a significant moment, not just for Australia and the United States, but around the world. It was responsible for inspiring so many people, and many of us have our own stories to tell. And I too watched the moon landing. I sat there with my sister and we both watched that, the first steps of Neil Armstrong on the moon. And can I say, as an engineer now, that not only did I want to be on that spaceship, I wanted to build it. So it inspired not only me, but it inspired many other people to go on and to study science, technology, engineering and maths. And we know how important that is for the jobs of the future. Now, in Australia, we already have a fair-sized space industry. It's worth about $3.9 billion to the Australian economy and employs about 10,000 people. Now, the coalition government is committed to growing the space industry in Australia to $12 billion and additional 20,000 jobs by 2030.
Member for Bruce can leave under 94A.
Importantly,
Member for Bruce can leave under 94A or I'll name him.
Why would you interject on this?
Yep.
He's a goose.
Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, importantly, space is not just about launch. Space impacts us all, every single day. Australian farmers use space capability to monitor the health of their crops. Emergency workers track the progress of bushfires, and scientists study the impacts and the effects of drought. And we all know how important it is for our farmers that we use every available resource to help them in this particularly difficult experience and time that they have. So we on this side of the House are committed to growing the space industry so that we are developing more jobs for scientists, for engineers, for technicians, for tradespeople. We want to make sure that our young people have opportunities that they never would have thought of 50 years ago for the jobs of the future. And, Mr Speaker, let me say this. Space has long been called the final frontier, but under the Morrison government, space is the new jobs frontier.
The member for McEwen, yet again. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister maintain that the inquiry undertaken by his Departmental Secretary into the affairs of former Ministers Pyne and Bishop was rigorous and based on a full disclosure of all relevant facts?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I'm pleased to table the reply that I was provided by the Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet that goes into the matter that the member has raised questions over. I have no reason to doubt at all the competence of the Secretary of the Department in relation to these matters whatsoever. My simple question is, why does the Labor Party seem to question the competency of the Secretary? The transparency of the arrangements that he's entered into are there for them to see. All I can see is this is just another attempt by the Labor Party to get into the old, what the former manager of government business used to call the chum bucket, Mr Speaker. They're going back to the old chum bucket, as they always do. Labor never changes their business model of grubby politics in this place, and this seems to be going down the same track.
The member for Bass.
Thank you. My question is for the Minister for Health. Will the minister outline to the House how a stronger economy enables the government to make available life-changing medicines for cystic fibrosis on the PBS that without this subsidy would be unaffordable?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Bass, who even before she came to this place was passionate about support for patients with cystic fibrosis. During the course of the campaign, she and the Prime Minister met with 12-year-old Luke Emery in northern Tasmania, a young boy with cystic fibrosis who's a beneficiary of Orkambi. Orkambi is a medicine that, along with the Prime Minister, we were able to list last year, and that medicine would otherwise cost approximately $250,000 and be beyond the reach of virtually every patient. And Luke has his future before him because of that medicine. But I know that the member for Bass, along with many others, has been an unstinting advocate for further and better action for cystic fibrosis and other issues. And we know that it's very important that we can afford to do these things. Previously, 2011, as was well discussed during the course of the last parliament, a previous government stopped listing new medicines, including medicines for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and for asthma, when at the time they said they had run out of funding, or quote-unquote due to fiscal circumstances. They were unable to list further medicines until such time as fiscal circumstances permit. Fortunately, the fiscal circumstances are strong, and I want to thank and acknowledge the work of the Prime Minister, the Treasurer, the Finance Minister, but above all else the Australian people who've been able to do this, to allow these medicines to be listed. In that context, yesterday I am delighted that we were able to announce Kalydeco, which is a new medicine for cystic fibrosis for beautiful young children between 12 and 24 months of age. These children, these beautiful children, would otherwise not have had access to a medicine that would cost $300,000 per year. And because of the work, because of the capacity to have this PBS on a strong, clear footing, these medicines are now available. And from the 1st of August, Kaleido will be available. And yesterday I met young children such as Anna as well as Scarlett. Scarlett is a 5-year-old, as bright as a button, from Tasmania. And with Scarlett, what we saw is something very special. This young girl had been through the situation of early access to Kaleido. Her health is better, her lungs are better, her life is before her. And that is what this government is about. We do the things we do to strengthen the economy so as we can afford these medicines. And we afford these medicines so as we never do.
The member for McMahon
we never
will
do
cease
what happened
interjecting.
under a previous government where they stopped listing medicines for COPD and asthma. That's the difference between what we do and what happened on his watch.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister tell the House how a claim that Julie Bishop had nothing to do with palladium in the 5 years she was minister is consistent with her appearing in a video filmed in her office titled "Australia's Foreign Minister Julie Bishop commends Palladium's business partnerships platform," which was posted to the Palladium Make It Possible site?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I refer the member to the report which was provided to me by the Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr Speaker, I move that so much of the standing and sessional orders be suspended, as would prevent the Manager of Opposition Business from moving the following motion immediately. That the House, 1, notes that A, today the Prime Minister provided a letter to the Senate and the House from his Departmental Secretary relating to the inquiry into the compliance of former Ministers Christopher Pyne and Julie Bishop with the ministerial standards. B, the letter advised the Prime Minister that Ms Bishop told the Secretary that she had no contact with Palladium as Minister for Foreign Affairs. C, Ms Bishop appeared in a video filmed in her ministerial office and published on Palladium's Facebook page on 9 June 2017, titled, and I quote, "Australia's Foreign Minister Julie Bishop commends shared value in Palladium's business partnership platform." D, during the period Ms Bishop was Minister for Foreign Affairs, the company Palladium and its related entities entered into contracts with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade valued at over $600 million. E, the integrity of this government is linked to the observance and enforcement of the ministerial standards. And F, unanswered questions remain in relation to the relationship between Ms Bishop and the departmental contractor on whose board she now sits, and the rigour of the inquiry by the Prime Minister's Departmental Secretary. And 2, therefore calls on the Prime Minister to direct his Departmental Secretary to reopen the inquiry into former Minister Bishop. Speaker, the letter that the Prime Minister has tabled here, which, mind you, was tabled in the Senate, and until question time he had no intention of even tabling it in the House of Representatives, notwithstanding that both ministers were ministers in the House of Representatives, both ministers who decided it was time to resign once he became Prime Minister of Australia.
The Manager of Opposition Business will just resume his seat for a second. The Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, we move that the member be no longer heard.
The Leader of the House has moved. Leader of the House has moved. He needs to. The Leader of the House just needs to move it himself. Yeah. No, I've already got the issue in hand. I'm not sure if it's in anyone's interest to let the clock just keep ticking, but if you want to argue along those lines, we can. I was just pointing out to the Leader of the House. He needs. If a motion is to be moved, it has to be moved by one person.
The motion is mine. I move that the member no longer be heard.
The question is that the Manager of Opposition Business be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. No. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes. Lock the doors. Order. The question is the Manager of Opposition Business be no further heard. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I appoint the honourable members for Gray and Nichols tell us for the ayes, and the honourable members for Lawler and Werriwa tell us for the noes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 76, noes 69. So the question's been resolved in the affirmative. Is the motion moved by the Manager of Opposition Business seconded? I call the member for Port Adelaide.
Thank you. I second the motion. Shutting down this debate says everything you need to know about
resume
this.
his seat. I call the Leader of the House. The Leader of the House has the call.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the member no longer be heard.
The question is that the member for Port Adelaide be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute.
Mark had nothing else. Hey, Mark, you have a second line.
For the information of members, because this is a 1 minute division, I appoint the same tellers as the previous division. Members must remain in their seats unless they're leaving the chamber or they did not vote in the previous division, or they're changing their vote, in which case they must report to the tellers. Lock the doors. The question is that the member for Port Adelaide be no further heard. Members must remain in their seats unless they're changing their vote or did not vote in the previous division, in which case they need to report to the tellers. Order. The result of the division is ayes 76, no 69, and questions therefore resolved in the affirmative. The question now is that the motion moved by the Manager of Opposition Business be agreed to. I call the member for Griffith.
Dodger it gets, Mr Speaker. This is an absolute
The member
disgrace.
for Griffith will resume her seat. The Leader of the House has
Mr Speaker, I move that the question be put.
The question is that the question be put. All those of that opinion say aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Let's ring the bells for 1 minute again. I appoint the same tellers as the previous division, and as members should know, they need to remain in their seats unless they're leaving the chamber or did not vote in the previous division, or they're changing their vote, in which case they must report to the tellers. Lock the doors. The question is that the motion be put. Members must remain in their seats unless they're changing their vote or did not vote in the previous division, in which case they must report to the tellers. Order. The result of the division is ayes 76, noes 69. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. I won't put the next question because the time allotted— Okay. So the question is that the motion moved by the Manager of Opposition Business be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. No. I think the noes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute, but the tellers will do a full count. Order. Lock the doors. The question is that the motion moved by the Manager of Opposition Business be agreed to. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I appoint the honourable members for Lawler and Werriwa tellers for the ayes, and the honourable members for Gray and Nichols tellers for the noes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 65, noes 75. The question is therefore negatived. Members can take their seats. It's my understanding question time will now resume. Member for Wright and a few others, can you stop blocking the road up there? I'll say it again, if members can resume their seats, question time can resume. The member for O'Connor.
My question is to the Minister for Education. Will the Minister please update the House on the...
The member for O'Connor just pause. I'm just not sure his microphone's on. I'll just get him to start again. The member for O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
That's better.
My question is to the Minister for Education. Will the Minister please update the House on the government's plans to support Australians' access to higher education, particularly in regional, rural and remote Australia?
The Minister for Education has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for O'Connor for his question. I know he's a passionate advocate for regional and rural Australia, and he stands with all of us on this side in our passion to ensuring that regional and rural Australia gets the services that they need, including the educational services. $17.7 billion this year will be provided into the higher education sector for teaching and for research by this government. We want to ensure that all Australians, no matter where they live, get the education that they deserve. And that includes the 400,000 students living in regional and rural Australia. And it's why last year we announced $135 million in a regional Australia higher education package. That included nearly 2,000 additional scholarships for regional and rural Australia. It also included $92.5 million for regional universities, and I know the member for Herbert will like this because $9.1 million went to James Cook University. It also included money for 16 regional study hubs, and I visited one of those regional study hubs in Barker, where there is one being provided in the Barossa, and I know the member for Barker is a fierce advocate for regional study hubs. And not only that, this year we announced an additional $94 million for the Destination Australia program, and that means that international students and local students will get scholarships to study at regional universities, and that will improve regional universities even further and make sure that they get the students they need. On top of that, we've provided $2 million to make sure that young people in rural areas aspire to get a higher education degree. On this side, we are backing rural and regional Australia. Now, I say to those opposite, when I was a young boy growing up on a family farm, right, we went through the '82 drought. Now you might think that this is funny, but in 1982 we were impacted by the drought. That has stayed with me today, the memories of that drought and the impact that it had. And I say to you, put the politics aside. That $5 billion that will drought-proof Australia, that's what it's designed to do, Drought-proof Australia needs to be passed by this parliament so that everyone in this place supports rural and regional Australia. So get behind it.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper as we